A clue isn't hidden, it's simply overlooked. I'm Miss Marple. Welcome to my new case.
The great hall of Ashworth Manor glowed with the warm light of a dozen candles, their flames dancing across the polished mahogany table where the remnants of Christmas dinner lay in festive disarray. Snow continued its gentle assault against the tall windows, transforming the Cotswold village of Little Wickham into a scene worthy of a Christmas card. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly near the blazing hearth, her pale blue eyes taking in the convivial scene with the practiced attention of someone who had spent a lifetime observing the curious ways of human nature. The annual Christmas gathering at the manor had become something of a tradition since Mrs. Eleanor Ashworth had inherited the estate from her late husband 2 years prior. This evening she had outdone herself, welcoming nearly 20 guests from the village and beyond to partake in roasted goose, plum pudding, and enough mulled wine to warm even the most reserved of English hearts. Miss Marple's gaze settled momentarily on their host's nephew, Captain Jeremy Ashworth, whose handsome features bore the slightly strained expression of a man whose debts exceeded his expectations. He had been particularly attentive to Miss Sylvia Pemberton, the village schoolmistress, though whether from genuine affection or the knowledge that she had recently inherited a modest fortune remained unclear. Across the table, Dr. Geoffrey Hartwell, recently returned from his medical training in London, engaged in animated conversation with the local solicitor, Mr. Edmund Blackwood, while Mrs. Blackwood appeared distracted, frequently glancing toward the head of the table with an expression that Miss Marple found rather telling. At the center of the evening's festivities sat Mr. Alistair Finch, Mrs. Ashworth's distant cousin who had arrived unexpectedly from London a fortnight ago. A man of considerable girth and even more considerable opinions, Mr. Finch had dominated much of the dinner conversation with tales of his business ventures and pointed observations about village life that had left several guests visibly uncomfortable. His booming laugh punctuated the evening at regular intervals, often following remarks that others found less amusing than he did. "Marvellous pudding, Eleanor," Mr. Finch declared, raising his brandy glass with a flourish that sent a few drops splashing onto the white tablecloth. "Quite the finest Christmas feast I've enjoyed in years. London society could learn a thing or two about proper hospitality from Little Wickham." Mrs. Ashworth smiled graciously, though Miss Marple noticed the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested the compliment was not entirely welcome. The elderly detective had observed similar expressions throughout the evening whenever Mr. Finch held forth on his various theories about village life, local customs, or the financial prospects of his fellow guests. As the evening progressed toward its natural conclusion, guests began to gather their wraps and exchange the warm farewells that marked the end of a successful Christmas celebration. The vicar, Reverend Ponsonby, folded his napkin with characteristic precision while discussing the morning's service with Mrs. Blackwood. Captain Ashworth assisted Miss Pemberton with her shawl, their conversation conducted in the low tones of intimacy that did not go unnoticed by several observers. It was then that Miss Marple's attention was drawn to Mr. Finch, who remained seated at the table, his head tilted back against the high-backed chair in what appeared to be a state of post-prandial contentment. His eyes were closed, a slight smile playing about his lips, and his brandy glass sat half empty beside his coffee cup. The picture he presented was one of complete satisfaction with the evening's pleasures. "Alistair seems to have succumbed to the Christmas spirit," Mrs. Ashworth observed with fond amusement as she noticed her cousin's apparent slumber. "Perhaps we should let him rest a moment before disturbing him." Dr. Hartwell, however, had approached the table with the professional concern that his medical training had instilled. "Mr. Finch," he called softly, placing a gentle hand on the older man's shoulder. When there was no response, he tried again, more firmly. "Mr. Finch." The silence that followed seemed to stretch indefinitely, broken only by the soft crackling of the fire and the whisper of snow against glass. Dr. Hartwell's expression changed subtly as he pressed his fingers against Mr. Finch's wrist, then moved to check for breath. The transformation in his demeanor was immediate and unmistakable. "Mrs. Ashworth," he said quietly, his voice carrying a gravity that instantly commanded attention. "I'm afraid Mr. Finch won't be waking. He's dead." Miss Marple remained perfectly still in her chair, her knitting needles motionless in her lap. In the sudden hush that descended upon the room, she found herself reflecting on the curious ways in which death chose its moments, arriving not with drama or fanfare, but in the quiet aftermath of laughter and fellowship, when least expected and most unwelcome. The silence that followed Dr. Hartwell's pronouncement seemed to press against the walls of the great hall like a living thing. Mrs. Ashworth's face drained of color, her hand moving instinctively to steady herself against the back of a chair. The gracious hostess who had presided over the evening's festivities found herself confronting an entirely different sort of guest, one that had arrived uninvited and would not be easily dismissed. "Dead," she whispered, as though speaking the word softly might somehow lessen its finality. But he was perfectly well just moments ago, laughing, telling that dreadful story about the bishop and the Christmas pudding. Captain Ashworth moved swiftly to his aunt's side, his military bearing asserting itself in the face of crisis. Yet Miss Marple, observing from her quiet corner by the fire, noticed something in his expression that went beyond concern for his aunt's distress. There was a tightness around his eyes, a careful control that suggested relief rather than grief. She filed this observation away with the same methodical precision she applied to her knitting patterns. Dr. Hartwell continued his examination with professional thoroughness, checking pulse points and observing Mr. Finch's coloring with growing perplexity. "The circumstances are somewhat unusual," he admitted reluctantly. "His appearance suggests a peaceful passing, yet there are certain inconsistencies that concern me as a medical man." "What sort of inconsistencies?" inquired Mr. Blackwood, his solicitor's training immediately grasping the implications of the doctor's hesitation. "His coloring is rather good for a man who has supposedly died of heart failure," Dr. Hartwell explained carefully. "And there's a peculiar quality to his expression, almost as if he were merely sleeping rather than—" He paused, clearly reluctant to voice suspicions that might transform a sad but natural death into something far more sinister. Miss Pemberton pressed her handkerchief to her lips, her eyes wide with distress. "Surely you don't mean to suggest—" "I mean, we all shared the same meal, drank from the same bottles. If there had been anything amiss with the food?" "Not necessarily," the doctor replied gently. "Individual portions, personal preferences in seasoning, even the timing of consumption, there are many variables that could affect one person differently than others." The word poison hung unspoken in the air, yet its presence was as palpable as the smoke from the dying fire. Mrs. Blackwood moved closer to her husband, her earlier distraction replaced by genuine fear. Throughout the evening, she had watched Mr. Finch with the wariness of someone expecting an unpleasant revelation, and now that expectation had taken an entirely unexpected form. "We must contact the authorities immediately," Mrs. Ashworth declared, her voice gaining strength as shock gave way to practical necessity. "Whatever the cause, a man has died in my home. The police must be notified." "In this weather?" Captain Ashworth gestured toward the windows, where snow continued to fall with increasing intensity. "The roads will be impassable by morning. We may find ourselves quite isolated until the storm passes." Miss Marple observed how this prospect affected the assembled guests differently. Some appeared genuinely distressed at the thought of being trapped with a corpse, while others seemed almost relieved at the delay in official scrutiny. The vicar murmured something about divine timing, though his usual cheerful demeanor had been replaced by an oddly troubled expression. Word of Mr. Finch's death began to spread through the manor's staff with the inexorable efficiency of water finding its level. Mason, the butler, appeared at regular intervals with updates on the weather and offers of assistance, his professional composure barely concealing his fascination with the evening's dramatic turn. The footman who had been dispatched to notify the local constable returned with news that Constable Davies would attempt to reach the manor despite the conditions, though his arrival might be delayed until morning. As the immediate shock began to wear off, conversations resumed in hushed tones throughout the hall. Miss Marple listened with the appearance of an elderly lady seeking comfort in familiar voices, while actually cataloguing the various theories and observations being shared. He did seem to enjoy his food rather too much, Mrs. Blackwood murmured to her husband. Perhaps his heart simply couldn't manage such rich fare. More likely it was his tongue that proved too rich for his own good, Captain Ashworth replied quietly to Miss Pemberton. Uncle Alistair had a talent for saying precisely what others preferred to keep private. The schoolmistress nodded thoughtfully. He did seem to know a great deal about everyone's affairs. That comment about the church restoration fund was particularly awkward. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes moved thoughtfully from speaker to speaker, noting not just what was said, but what remained carefully unspoken. Mr. Finch had indeed been a man who collected secrets like some people collected stamps, and she suspected that his sudden departure from the world might prove far more convenient for certain individuals than their expressions of grief would suggest. The cozy Christmas gathering had transformed into something altogether more complex, and she found herself reflecting that human nature, like the weather outside, could change with remarkable and sometimes dangerous swiftness. The immediate shock of Dr. Hartwell's pronouncement gave way to a peculiar sort of reorganization, as though the household were instinctively arranging itself around this new and unwelcome guest. Mrs. Ashworth, recovering her composure with admirable swiftness, suggested they retire to the morning room while leaving the dining hall undisturbed. The wisdom of this arrangement was immediately apparent to Miss Marple, who observed how readily each person accepted the need to remain within the manor until proper authorities could be summoned. The morning room, with its cheerful chintz and crackling fire, provided a stark contrast to the somber circumstances that had brought them together. Miss Marple settled herself near the hearth, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm as she listened to the subdued conversations that began to emerge around her. Tea was served, and she noticed how gratefully each person accepted this return to familiar ritual, as though the simple act of pouring and stirring might restore some semblance of normalcy to their disrupted evening. "Such a dreadful thing to happen on Christmas night," Mrs. Ashworth murmured, her hands trembling slightly as she distributed cups. Poor Alistair seemed so content just moments before. He was laughing at his own story about the bishop and the Christmas pudding. Dr. Hartwell stood apart from the group, his professional demeanor masking what Miss Marple recognized as genuine perplexity. "The circumstances are rather unusual," he admitted when pressed by Mr. Blackwood's legal mind for specifics. "His appearance suggests a peaceful passing, yet there are certain inconsistencies that concern me. The coloring, the expression, it's almost as though he simply fell asleep." "But surely," interrupted Miss Pemberton, her schoolmistress's logic asserting itself, "if there had been anything amiss with the food or drink, we would all have been affected. We shared the same meal after all." It was then that Mason, the butler, appeared with additional refreshments, followed by young Lily, the under-housemaid, whose flushed cheeks betrayed both excitement and nervousness at finding herself part of such dramatic proceedings. As she arranged the additional cups and biscuits, Miss Marple observed her with the gentle attention she might give to a particularly intricate stitch pattern. "I do hope we haven't disarranged anything important in the dining room," Miss Marple remarked conversationally. "I noticed Mr. Finch had such particular preferences about his coffee service." Lily's eyes brightened with the pleasure of being consulted. "Oh, yes, ma'am. Very particular he was. Always wanted the blue and gilt cup, said it kept the coffee hotter. And he wouldn't have milk, only sugar from the white loaf, never the brown. I had to fetch more from the pantry because the little bowl by the pot was nearly empty." The second bowl came from the sideboard, Mason added with professional precision. "I replaced the serving tongs as well. The first pair had a loose hinge that Mr. Finch found irritating." Miss Marple's needles paused almost imperceptibly. "How thoughtful of you. and who attended to the coffee service during dinner. "I poured for everyone," Mrs. Ashworth replied, though Alistair, Mr. Finch, always insisted on managing his own sugar. He was quite particular about the amount. Captain Ashworth, who had been listening with growing tension, interjected with forced casualness, which certainly eliminates any suggestion that something was added to his cup without his knowledge. The comment hung in the air with uncomfortable weight. Miss Marple continued her knitting, but her pale blue eyes moved thoughtfully from face to face, cataloguing the various expressions of discomfort that followed the captain's observation. He did make rather pointed remarks during dinner, Miss Pemberton said quietly, about the Church Restoration Fund, and about private matters that perhaps should have remained private. Mrs. Blackwood's gloved hands tightened in her lap. Alistair Finch delighted in knowing other people's business. He hinted at irregularities, suggested improprieties where none existed. It was most uncharitable, particularly at Christmas. The vicar, who had remained largely silent, finally spoke with obvious distress. He implied there were discrepancies in the church accounts. That was unjust. There are simply misunderstandings about pledges and receipts. Nothing more. He knew far too much about everyone's affairs, Captain Ashworth added, his military bearing unable to quite conceal an underlying tension. Made comments about wills, about debts, about matters that were frankly none of his concern. Miss Marple observed how this revelation affected the assembled company. Mr. Finch, it seemed, had positioned himself as a collector of secrets, a dangerous occupation in any small community. She found herself reflecting that knowledge, like certain chemicals, could prove quite toxic when concentrated in the wrong hands. As the conversation continued, she quietly excused herself to retrieve her mislaid knitting bag, though her true purpose led her back to the dining hall. There, by candlelight, she studied the coffee service with the methodical attention of someone reading a particularly complex pattern. The blue and gilt cup sat slightly apart from the others, a faint stain marking its rim. 2 sugar bowls remained on the sideboard, one nearly empty, the other full. 2 sets of tongs lay nearby, one with a barely perceptible looseness in its hinge, the other gleaming and precise. It was all quite ordinary, Miss Marple reflected, and therein lay both the challenge and the solution. In her experience, the most extraordinary crimes often hid behind the most mundane of circumstances, revealed only by careful attention to the small inconsistencies that others might dismiss as unimportant. When Miss Marple returned to the morning room, she carried with her more than just her retrieved knitting bag. Her brief examination of the dining hall had provided several interesting observations, though she kept these reflections to herself as she settled back into her chair by the fire. The assembled company had arranged itself into small clusters, their conversations conducted in the hushed tones that death inevitably brings to social gatherings. Dr. Hartwell stood near the tall windows, ostensibly watching the continuing snowfall, but clearly wrestling with professional concerns that extended beyond his initial pronouncement. His periodic glances toward the dining hall suggested he was reconsidering aspects of Mr. Finch's condition, though he seemed reluctant to voice whatever doubts were forming in his medically trained mind. "The weather shows no sign of improving," he observed, though Miss Marple suspected his comment served more to fill an uncomfortable silence than to provide meteorological updates. "I doubt Constable Davies will manage the roads before morning, even with the best intentions." Captain Ashworth moved restlessly about the room, his military bearing unable to quite disguise an underlying tension that Miss Marple found increasingly noteworthy. "Perhaps that's for the best," he suggested with carefully measured casualness. "Gives everyone time to collect themselves before the inevitable questions begin." "What sort of questions?" Miss Pemberton asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the nature of official inquiry. Mr. Blackwood adjusted his spectacles with the precision of a man accustomed to legal complexities. "The sort that arise when a gentleman dies unexpectedly in company, particularly when that gentleman had made himself somewhat unpopular through his observations about local affairs. Mrs. Ashworth's teacup rattled slightly against its saucer. "Surely you don't mean to suggest that Alistair was deliberately... that someone would actually—" "Of course not," Dr. Hartwell interjected, though his tone lacked the conviction his words attempted to convey. "I merely meant that in cases of sudden death, certain procedures must be followed. Questions asked, circumstances examined." Miss Marple's needles resumed their gentle rhythm as she observed how this prospect affected each person differently. The vicar appeared almost eager for the arrival of proper authority, as though official questioning might somehow absolve him of unspoken guilt. Mrs. Blackwood sat rigidly upright, her gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap, while her husband maintained the careful composure of someone preparing legal defenses before they were required. He did seem remarkably well informed about everyone's private business, Mrs. Blackwood ventured hesitantly, made comments during dinner that were hardly appropriate for Christmas conversation. Such as, Dr. Hartwell prompted with professional interest. The question produced an uncomfortable pause before Captain Ashworth answered with obvious reluctance. He implied that certain financial arrangements in the village were not entirely straightforward, suggested that some people were living beyond their apparent means or that debts might not be what they seemed. Miss Pemberton's colour deepened. He mentioned my recent inheritance, though I cannot imagine how he learned the particulars. The solicitors assured me such matters were handled with complete discretion. Alistair had a talent for discovering information others preferred to keep private, Mr. Blackwood admitted uncomfortably. He hinted at irregularities in various accounts, suggested improprieties where none existed. The vicar sighed deeply. The Church Restoration Fund. He claimed to have noticed discrepancies, though I assured him there were simply misunderstandings about pledges and receipts. Nothing more serious than administrative confusion. Miss Marple found herself reflecting on her brief examination of the coffee service. The blue and gilt cup, positioned just slightly apart from the others, bore the faint coffee stain of a man particular about his comforts. More intriguing were the few irregular sugar grains she had noticed on the damask cloth. Not the neat cubes one would expect from proper loaf sugar, but rather the coarser crystals that might come from a different source entirely. The presence of 2 sugar bowls and 2 sets of serving tongs suggested someone had taken considerable care to accommodate Mr. Finch's preferences, perhaps more care than the situation had actually required. Did Mr. Finch specify the nature of these supposed irregularities? She asked gently, her tone suggesting nothing more than elderly curiosity about village gossip. Mrs. Ashworth spoke with visible reluctance. He implied that certain wills might not reflect the true intentions of the deceased, suggested that undue influence had been exerted in some cases, that beneficiaries might not be entirely legitimate. Captain Ashworth's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He also made pointed comments about debts and obligations, hinted that some people's financial difficulties were more serious than they appeared. Rather ungentlemanly, really, particularly at Christmas. Miss Marple observed how each revelation seemed to add another layer of tension to the room's atmosphere. Mr. Finch had clearly positioned himself as a threat to multiple people, collecting their secrets with the enthusiasm of a philatelist and displaying them with considerably less discretion. Such behavior, while socially objectionable, rarely proved fatal unless the secrets in question carried genuine danger for their keepers. As the conversation continued, she noticed how carefully each person avoided direct eye contact when discussing Mr. Finch's revelations. There was guilt in this room, perhaps multiple guilts, though whether any of them were serious enough to justify the permanent silencing of an inconvenient observer remained the crucial question that would require considerably more delicate investigation to answer. The decision to remain at the manor overnight settled over the company with the weight of necessity rather than choice. Mrs. Ashworth, recovering her composure with admirable efficiency, began arranging sleeping accommodations while Mason assured everyone that fires would be lit and warming pans provided. The storm showed no signs of abating, and the roads remained impassable. a circumstance that seemed to bring relief to some faces and apprehension to others. Miss Marple accepted the offer of the lavender room on the second floor with gracious thanks, though her pale blue eyes continued their methodical observation of the assembled company. As the group began to disperse toward their temporary quarters, she made a gentle request that seemed entirely natural for an elderly lady concerned about her comfort. "If I might just retrieve my woolen shawl from the dining room," she mentioned to young Lily, who had been assigned to see to the fires. "I find it so reassuring in uncertain weather, and I believe I left it near the sideboard." The dining hall, when they entered it, had taken on the solemn quality that death inevitably brings to familiar spaces. The candlelight cast long shadows across the mahogany table, where Mr. Finch remained in his chair, his expression still bearing that curious look of peaceful contentment that Dr. Hartwell had found so puzzling. "You managed the evening service beautifully," Miss Marple observed conversationally as she moved toward the sideboard. "Such particular requests can be quite challenging, but you handled everything with remarkable competence." Lily's anxious expression softened under the warmth of unexpected praise. "Thank you, ma'am. Mason always says that keeping one's head is worth having two pairs of hands, and Mr. Finch was ever so particular about his things." "Indeed he was," Miss Marple agreed, her attention apparently focused on locating her shawl while actually examining the coffee service with the thoroughness of someone reading a complex pattern. The blue and gilt cup, the specific sugar preferences. Such attention to detail must have required considerable effort. "Oh, yes, ma'am. Captain Ashworth mentioned before dinner that Mr. Finch favored that particular cup, said it would keep him sweet if everything was just as he liked it." Lily's voice carried the pride of someone who had successfully managed a difficult task. "And the sugar, he was most insistent about the white loaf sugar, never the brown, and always from his own bowl." Miss Marple's fingers paused as she examined the sugar service more closely. Two bowls remained on the sideboard, one nearly empty, the other still containing a substantial quantity of white sugar. More intriguingly, scattered on the damask cloth near where the service had been arranged, were several irregular granules that caught the candlelight with an unusual brilliance. "I noticed you had to replace the serving tongs during the evening," she remarked with gentle curiosity. "Yes, ma'am. The first pair had a loose hinge that bothered Mr. Finch terribly. He said they made him lose his grip on the sugar lumps. Mason fetched the newer pair from the pantry, though by then Mr. Finch had already taken his first helping." The significance of this detail was not lost on Miss Marple, though she gave no outward sign of her growing interest. She bent to retrieve her shawl, which had indeed been left near the sideboard, and in doing so observed that the few sugar crystals on the cloth were notably different from the neat, uniform cubes that should have come from properly prepared loaf sugar. These were more irregular, with a faint discoloration that suggested they had been dissolved and reformed, a process that would require both chemical knowledge and considerable advanced planning. The household must have been quite busy preparing for such a large Christmas gathering, she observed, straightening with her shawl in hand. "Oh, yes, ma'am. Mrs. Price, that's the housekeeper, had us preparing for days. Special orders for Mr. Finch's preferences, extra supplies from the village, even that particular coffee blend he favored. Captain Ashworth was most helpful in ensuring everything would be exactly right." This revelation added another layer to Miss Marple's growing understanding of the evening's events. The captain's solicitous attention to his great-uncle's comfort took on a different significance when viewed alongside his obvious financial difficulties and the relief she had observed in his expression following the discovery of the death. Returning to the morning room, Miss Marple found the conversation had turned to the practical concerns of their unexpected confinement. Dr. Hartwell stood near the windows, his medical training clearly wrestling with the implications of what he had observed. The peaceful nature of Mr. Finch's passing, combined with certain subtle indicators he had noted, suggested possibilities that he seemed reluctant to voice without more definitive evidence. "I confess I remain troubled by certain aspects of Mr. Finch's condition," he admitted when pressed by Mrs. Ashworth's anxious questioning. The facial coloring, the expression of contentment. These are not entirely consistent with sudden heart failure. There are other possibilities that should be considered. Captain Ashworth, who had been maintaining a careful distance from these medical discussions, interjected with forced casualness. Surely the rich food and wine provide sufficient explanation. Uncle Alistair was never one for moderation in his pleasures. Perhaps, Dr. Hartwell replied diplomatically, though his tone suggested continued skepticism, though I would be more convinced if there had been any indication of distress or discomfort preceding his collapse. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles maintaining their gentle rhythm while her mind processed the accumulating evidence. The tampered sugar, the careful attention to Mr. Finch's specific preferences, the advanced planning required for such preparation, all pointed to a crime of considerable premeditation rather than spontaneous violence. "It occurs to me," she said with the mild curiosity of someone making conversation, "that a gentleman so particular about his refreshments might have been equally predictable in other aspects of his routine. Such habits can be quite comforting, though I suppose they might also make one rather vulnerable to those who understand them well." The comment produced a moment of uncomfortable silence before Miss Pemberton spoke with obvious distress. "You're not suggesting that someone that Mr. Finch was actually—" "I'm suggesting nothing more than an old woman's observation about the curious ways people develop their little preferences," Miss Marple replied gently, "though it does seem remarkable how well everyone understood exactly what would please him most." As the evening wound toward its close and the guests prepared to retire to their temporary quarters, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the deadly precision with which someone had transformed Mr. Finch's harmless vanities into the instrument of his destruction. The blue and gilt cup, the particular sugar, the careful timing, all suggested a mind that understood both chemistry and human nature with equal facility. The question that remained was which of the assembled company possessed both the knowledge and the motive to orchestrate such an elaborate and carefully planned murder. The morning dawned grey and still, transforming Ashworth Manor into an island of unease surrounded by an unbroken expanse of white. The snow had ceased its gentle assault during the night, but the roads remained impassable, effectively sealing the household away from outside authority and leaving them suspended in a peculiar state of enforced intimacy with both death and suspicion. Miss Marple observed from her window how the pristine landscape seemed to mock the corruption that had taken root within the manor's warm walls. Breakfast was arranged in the morning room, where the assembled company gathered with the awkward politeness of people thrust into unwanted proximity by circumstance. The cheerful fire and polished silver could not dispel the atmosphere of tension that had settled over them like morning mist. Mrs. Ashworth moved through her hostess duties with admirable composure, though Miss Marple noticed the slight tremor in her hands as she poured tea and the frequent glances toward the dining hall where Mr. Finch remained undisturbed. Dr. Hartwell entered with his medical bag and an expression that immediately commanded attention. "I took the liberty of conducting a more thorough examination during the early hours," he announced without preamble. "The circumstances of Mr. Finch's death require clarification before the authorities arrive." The silence that followed seemed to press against the windows like the snow outside. Captain Ashworth set down his coffee cup with deliberate precision, his military bearing unable to quite conceal an underlying tension that Miss Marple found increasingly significant. "What sort of clarification?" Mrs. Ashworth asked, though her tone suggested she feared the answer. "The symptoms I observed, combined with additional indicators noted this morning, are consistent with poisoning by alkaloid compounds, specifically substances that can be administered in crystalline form." Dr. Hartwell's professional certainty carried uncomfortable weight. The facial coloring, the expression of peaceful contentment, the complete absence of distress, these are not characteristic of natural death, but of a very particular class of poisons that mimic peaceful sleep. Miss Pemberton's teacup rattled against its saucer, but we all shared the same meal. "Not necessarily the same preparations," Dr. Hartwell replied gravely. Such compounds can be disguised as sugar or salt, particularly if mixed with something sweet enough to mask any residual taste. The victim would notice nothing unusual. Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle rhythm as she processed this confirmation of her growing suspicions. Her brief examination of the coffee service the previous evening had revealed irregularities in the sugar crystals, a graininess and slight discoloration that suggested chemical tampering rather than natural preparation. "The method suggests considerable planning," she observed with gentle curiosity. "Someone who understood not only Mr. Finch's particular preferences, but also possessed the chemical knowledge to prepare such a substance. The blue and gilt cup, the specific sugar bowl, even the timing of the service, all arranged with remarkable precision." Mr. Blackwood adjusted his spectacles nervously. "Surely you're not suggesting that someone at this table—" "I'm suggesting that Mr. Finch made himself remarkably unpopular through his observations about local affairs," Miss Marple replied mildly. "His comments during dinner revealed an uncomfortable familiarity with everyone's private business." The reminder of Mr. Finch's dinner conversation produced a series of uncomfortable exchanges. Captain Ashworth's jaw tightened as he recalled his great-uncle's pointed remarks about debts and expectations. Miss Pemberton flushed at the memory of questions raised about her inheritance, while the vicar appeared genuinely distressed by implications regarding the Church Restoration Fund. He threatened to expose what he called irregularities, Mrs. Blackwood said with visible reluctance, suggested that certain wills had been misinterpreted, that financial arrangements were not what they seemed. He collected secrets like some people collect stamps, Captain Ashworth added bitterly, made it clear he intended to use them if his own circumstances required adjustment. Miss Marple observed how each revelation added another layer of motive to the assembled company. Mr. Finch had positioned himself as a threat to multiple people, wielding their secrets with the enthusiasm of someone who enjoyed the power such knowledge provided. The careful planning evident in his murder suggested someone who had reached the conclusion that permanent silence was preferable to continued blackmail. "The particulars of the crime indicate intimate knowledge of household routines," she noted conversationally. "Someone familiar with the coffee service, the staff arrangements, even the specific timing required to ensure the poison reached its intended target without affecting others." As the morning progressed and the reality of their situation settled over the company, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the deadly precision with which someone had transformed the comfortable rituals of Christmas hospitality into an instrument of murder. The combination of chemical knowledge, detailed planning, and intimate familiarity with both the victim's habits and the household's operations pointed to a perpetrator who was not only among them but who had used their very presence at the Christmas gathering as both opportunity and camouflage for their carefully orchestrated crime. The morning's revelations had transformed the atmosphere in the manor from mere unease to something approaching dread when Mason appeared in the doorway with an expression that immediately commanded attention. His professional composure, which had weathered decades of domestic crises, showed unmistakable signs of strain. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Ashworth," he began with careful formality, "but there has been a development regarding the dining hall. When I went to secure the room this morning, I discovered certain irregularities." Mrs. Ashworth set down her teacup with visible effort. "What sort of irregularities, Mason?" "The blue and gilt cup has been washed and replaced, ma'am. Also the sugar bowl that was nearly empty yesterday evening. It's no longer on the sideboard. And the newer serving tongs that I fetched from the pantry have disappeared entirely." Dr. Hartwell's medical bag clicked shut with unusual sharpness. "Who had access to that room during the night?" "No one, sir. I locked the doors myself after concluding my examination, and the key remained in my possession." Mason's certainty carried the weight of professional pride wounded by the inexplicable. Miss Marple rose with unhurried grace, her pale blue eyes reflecting a sharpened interest. "Perhaps we might examine these changes together. Such domestic mysteries often reveal more than initially apparent." The procession to the dining hall carried an air of grim purpose. The morning light, filtered through snow-laden windows, cast long shadows across the mahogany table where Mr. Finch remained in his final repose. The blue and gilt cup sat beside his place-setting, unnaturally bright and bearing the telltale dampness of recent washing. The sideboard, where 2 sugar bowls had rested the previous evening, now displayed only one, the fuller bowl with its neat white cubes, while the space where the nearly empty bowl had sat remained conspicuously vacant. "The evidence has been deliberately altered," Dr. Hartwell observed with professional gravity. "Someone wished to remove any trace of the poison's delivery method." Miss Marple examined the remaining sugar bowl with the methodical attention she might give to a complex knitting pattern. "The missing items suggest someone understood precisely what evidence might prove incriminating. The washed cup, the removed bowl, the disappeared tongs, all elements that might have retained chemical residue." It was then that Captain Ashworth, who had been searching through Mr. Finch's personal effects at his aunt's request, returned with a leather portfolio and an expression of barely concealed agitation. "We found this among his papers," he announced, his voice carrying an odd mixture of triumph and distress. "It contains rather detailed documentation about various members of our community." Dr. Hartwell accepted the portfolio and began examining its contents, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "These are not casual observations. Mr. Finch appears to have been conducting systematic investigations into private financial matters. There are detailed analyses of debts, copies of correspondence, even questions raised about the propriety of certain legal arrangements." The revelation struck the assembled company like a physical blow. Miss Pemberton pressed her handkerchief to her lips as Dr. Hartwell described documentation questioning her inheritance, while the vicar appeared genuinely stricken by implications regarding church fund management. Mrs. Blackwood moved instinctively closer to her husband as references to questionable will modifications were mentioned. "He was blackmailing people," Mrs. Ashworth said with dawning comprehension. "The Christmas invitation, his unexpected arrival from London, it was all part of some elaborate scheme to extract money from his victims." Miss Marple observed how each person processed this revelation differently. Some appeared genuinely shocked, while others displayed the careful composure of those who had suspected the truth. The dynamics of guilt and innocence shifted perceptibly around the room, as though invisible alliances were rearranging themselves in response to this new understanding. "There's something else," Captain Ashworth added, producing a folded paper from the portfolio. A draft letter addressed to the village newspaper, detailing specific accusations against— He paused, his eyes meeting those of the vicar. "Against the Church Restoration Fund management." The letter's contents, when read aloud, painted a damning picture of financial irregularities and personal enrichment at the expense of parish funds. The vicar's distress appeared genuine and profound, his stammered denials carrying the ring of a man whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. Yet Miss Marple found herself studying not the accused, but the accuser, noting how Captain Ashworth's initial tension seemed to ease as attention focused on the vicar, how his discovery of the evidence appeared almost too convenient, too perfectly timed. In her experience, the most dangerous criminals were often those who understood how to direct suspicion away from themselves by providing alternative targets. "It's remarkable," she observed gently, her knitting needles resuming their rhythmic dance, "how thoroughly someone has attempted to guide our understanding of these events. The washed cup removes evidence, while the discovered documents provide motives. One might almost think someone wishes us to reach a particular conclusion about Mr. Finch's death." The comment produced an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the soft crackling of the fire and the whisper of snow against glass. Miss Marple reflected that whoever had orchestrated this elaborate deception possessed not only chemical knowledge and intimate familiarity with household routines, but also a sophisticated understanding of human psychology, the ability to manipulate both evidence and emotions with equal skill. The question remained whether their carefully constructed narrative would prove as convincing to official scrutiny as it appeared to their fellow guests. The morning's discoveries had transformed the atmosphere from suspicion to something approaching dread, yet Miss Marple found herself most intrigued, not by what had been revealed, but by what someone had been so desperate to conceal. The systematic removal of evidence from the dining hall, the washed cup, the missing sugar bowl, the vanished tongs, spoke of a calculating mind that understood both chemistry and investigation with equal facility. As the assembled company processed the implications of Mr. Finch's blackmail portfolio, Miss Marple observed their reactions with the methodical attention she might give to a complex knitting pattern. The vicar appeared genuinely crushed by the accusations regarding church funds, while Miss Pemberton seemed more shocked by the audacity of the schemes than personally threatened. Mrs. Blackwood displayed a curious shift from anxiety to cautious relief, as though the focus on others diverted attention from her own potential vulnerabilities. It was Captain Ashworth who commanded Miss Marple's particular attention. His restless energy, the way his comments consistently guided conversation toward the vicar's alleged improprieties, the careful precision with which he deflected scrutiny, all suggested a mind actively managing the investigation's direction rather than simply responding to its discoveries. She chose her moment with the patience of someone who had spent decades observing human nature. During a lull in Dr. Hartwell's examination of the remaining documents, she spoke with gentle curiosity that masked razor-sharp purpose. "It's quite remarkable how thoroughly Mr. Finch documented everyone's affairs," she began conversationally. "He truly had an eye for detail, even the smallest particulars. Like his sugar preferences, for instance. Young Lily mentioned how specific he was about using only white loaf sugar from his own bowl." Captain Ashworth, who had been standing by the windows watching the continuing snowfall, turned with practiced courtesy. Indeed, Miss Marple, Uncle Alistair was remarkably set in his ways, always insisted that precise measurements were crucial for the perfect cup. "Yes," Miss Marple continued, her pale blue eyes fixed thoughtfully on her knitting, "and I recall Lily mentioning that the little bowl needed replenishing because it was nearly empty. Yet when I briefly returned to the dining room last evening, I noticed something rather curious about the sugar crystals scattered near his place setting." The room's attention focused on her with the intensity that significant details command in the aftermath of violent death. Dr. Hartwell looked up from his papers with professional interest, while several faces displayed varying degrees of tension. The crystals were quite irregular, Miss Marple observed with scientific precision. Not the neat, uniform cubes one expects from properly prepared loaf sugar. Rather coarse and uneven, with an odd crystalline quality, almost as though they had been dissolved in solution and then allowed to reform. Captain Ashworth's composed expression flickered almost imperceptibly, a momentary tightening around his eyes that someone less observant might have missed entirely. "Really? I confess I paid little attention to such details. Uncle Alistair wasn't always delicate in his movements, particularly after several brandies." "Perhaps," Miss Marple conceded gently, though her needles had ceased their rhythmic motion. "But the appearance was quite distinctive. If one were to dissolve a foreign substance into sugar crystals and allow them to dry, they might well take on such an irregular formation. Rather an ingenious delivery method. Wouldn't you agree, Dr. Hartwell?" The doctor's medical training immediately grasped the implications. "Extremely sophisticated, Miss Marple. Such preparation would require considerable chemical knowledge and extensive advanced planning. The alkaloid compounds I suspect were used must be refined to precise concentrations, not something accomplished spontaneously." It was then that young Lily, emboldened by the attention paid to her previous observations, ventured another contribution that shifted the investigation's entire foundation. "Begging your pardon," she said hesitantly, "but there's something else about the sugar arrangements. Captain Ashworth told me about Mr. Finch's particular preferences well before the gentleman arrived. Said we'd need special preparations for an important guest, though he didn't mention the name at first." The silence that followed seemed to expand like ripples in still water. Captain Ashworth's carefully maintained military bearing wavered slightly, revealing beneath it something that might have been calculation or desperation. Uncle Alistair's habits were well known to family members, he replied with measured precision. I merely wished to ensure proper hospitality for an elderly relative. Miss Marple observed how smoothly the explanation emerged, as though rehearsed for precisely this moment. Yet something in the captain's demeanor suggested performance rather than genuine recollection, the careful control of someone managing information rather than simply sharing it. It's curious how thoroughly someone anticipated every requirement, she remarked with deceptive mildness. The advanced preparations, the intimate knowledge of preferences, even the systematic removal of evidence afterward. One might almost admire such comprehensive planning if the purpose weren't so dreadful. Captain Ashworth's jaw tightened almost, imperceptibly, his gaze moving restlessly around the room as though seeking escape from increasingly uncomfortable scrutiny. The psychological pressure of Miss Marple's gentle persistence was beginning to show cracks in his composed facade. Dr. Hartwell, studying the captain with new attention, spoke with medical authority. The type of poisoning I observed would indeed require weeks of preparation. The compounds must be carefully refined and tested to ensure both effectiveness and concealment. This was unquestionably premeditated murder. As morning progressed toward afternoon and the snow continued its relentless isolation of the manor, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the deadly precision with which someone had transformed Christmas hospitality into an instrument of murder. The question no longer concerned whether Captain Ashworth was guilty, but rather how she might prove what her careful observations had already revealed with devastating clarity. The afternoon settled over Ashworth Manor with the weight of accumulated suspicion, transforming the once cheerful morning room into something approaching a tribunal. Miss Marple had set aside her knitting with deliberate finality, her pale blue eyes reflecting a sharpened purpose that commanded the attention of everyone present. The psychological pressure of her increasingly pointed observations was beginning to show its effect on Captain Ashworth, whose military bearing displayed hairline cracks that suggested internal strain building toward an inevitable breaking point. She rose with unhurried grace, her elderly frame somehow commanding absolute authority despite its apparent frailty. I wonder if we might conduct a small demonstration, she suggested with deceptive mildness. Dr. Hartwell's medical findings have been most illuminating, but I find myself curious about certain practical aspects of last evening's coffee service arrangements. Mrs. Ashworth looked up from her needlework with obvious relief at any distraction from their grim circumstances. What sort of demonstration, Miss Marple? Nothing elaborate, she replied, moving toward the door with purposeful intent. Simply a reconstruction of how the poison was administered. I believe such details might prove instructive regarding both the method and the perpetrator. The suggestion produced a subtle shift in the room's dynamics. Captain Ashworth straightened with the alertness of someone recognizing potential danger, while Dr. Hartwell gathered his medical bag with professional interest. The procession to the dining hall carried an air of scientific inquiry that masked Miss Marple's true purpose, the systematic application of psychological pressure that would force truth from someone who had planned too carefully to be caught by conventional evidence alone. In the dining hall, where Mr. Finch remained in his final repose, Miss Marple began arranging the coffee service with methodical precision. The blue and gilt cup, now suspiciously pristine, sat beside its saucer while she examined the remaining sugar bowl with the thoroughness of someone conducting a chemistry experiment before witnesses who might prefer to remain unobserved. The poison was administered through the sugar, she began with quiet certainty, her voice carrying the weight of accumulated observation. Someone dissolved alkaloid compounds into a portion of white sugar crystals, allowing them to dry and reform into irregular shapes that would pass casual inspection while ensuring precise dosage delivery. Dr. Hartwell nodded approvingly. The crystalline structure would effectively mask both taste and appearance. remarkably sophisticated for what might superficially appear to be a domestic crime of passion. Miss Marple's pale blue eyes moved systematically around the assembled company before settling on Captain Ashworth with gentle but implacable focus. The preparation required intimate knowledge of Mr. Finch's particular habits, access to appropriate chemical compounds, and considerable advanced planning. Someone who understood both his personal vulnerabilities and this household's daily routines with exceptional thoroughness. She moved closer to the coffee service, her movements deliberate and educational. The murderer also possessed sufficient foresight to remove incriminating evidence afterward. The washed cup, the missing sugar bowl, the vanished tongs, all elements that might have retained chemical residue were systematically eliminated during the night by someone with unrestricted access to this room. Captain Ashworth's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, his military training unable to quite conceal the mounting tension beneath his carefully maintained exterior. Surely such detailed speculation requires more substantial foundation than domestic observation. Perhaps, Miss Marple conceded with deceptive gentleness, yet certain facts remain entirely indisputable. Young Lily mentioned that you provided comprehensive instructions about Mr. Finch's specific requirements well before his actual arrival, Captain Ashworth. Remarkably thorough preparation for what was supposedly an unexpected family visit. The observation struck with surgical precision. Captain Ashworth's carefully controlled composure flickered momentarily, revealing beneath it something that might have been calculation wrestling with desperation. Uncle Alistair's preferences were well established among family members. I merely wished to ensure appropriate hospitality for an elderly relative. Indeed, Miss Marple replied with continued gentleness that somehow carried more menace than direct accusation. Though one might reasonably wonder why such extensive advance preparations proved necessary for a relative whose visit was ostensibly unplanned. The special sugar arrangements, the particular cup selection, even the detailed staff instructions, all suggest someone who anticipated Mr. Finch's presence with remarkable accuracy and specific purpose. Dr. Hartwell, observing the captain with newly sharpened medical attention, spoke with professional authority that lent credibility to Miss Marple's systematic reconstruction. The type of alkaloid poisoning I observed would indeed require weeks of careful preparation. Such compounds must be precisely refined and extensively tested to ensure both lethal effectiveness and complete concealment from detection. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her expression reflecting the satisfaction of someone whose careful observations were receiving proper scientific validation. Quite so, Doctor, which naturally raises the crucial question of motive sufficient to justify such elaborate and extended planning. Mr. Finch's blackmail activities provide several theoretical possibilities, though I suspect the truth may prove rather more immediately personal than his general threats to community members. The silence that followed seemed to press against the snow-covered windows with the weight of unspoken truths and accumulating evidence that pointed inexorably toward a conclusion that everyone present could sense approaching, but none yet possessed the courage to voice directly. Miss Marple observed how each person processed these revelations differently, noting particularly how Captain Ashworth's hands had begun to clench and unclench with barely controlled tension, while his gaze moved restlessly around the room as though seeking escape from increasingly uncomfortable and inescapable scrutiny. The afternoon light filtering through the snow-laden windows cast long shadows across the dining hall as Miss Marple positioned herself with deliberate precision near the coffee service. The assembled company watched with the tense attention of people who sensed they were approaching a moment of terrible clarity, though none yet understood the full scope of what was about to be revealed. "I wonder if we might conduct a small demonstration," Miss Marple suggested with deceptive mildness, her pale blue eyes reflecting a sharpened purpose that commanded absolute attention. Dr. Hartwell's medical findings have been most illuminating, but I find myself curious about certain practical aspects of the poison's delivery method. She moved toward the pristine coffee service with unhurried grace, her elderly frame somehow commanding authority despite its apparent frailness. The alkaloid compounds Dr. Hartwell identified would require remarkably sophisticated preparation. Such substances must be dissolved into sugar crystals and allowed to reform, a process requiring both chemical knowledge and extensive advance planning. From her reticule, she produced a small square of damask cloth, its corner faintly dusted with irregular crystalline particles that caught the candlelight with unusual brilliance. I retrieved this last evening when collecting my shawl, an old habit of mine, to wrap any bit of sewing in whatever comes to hand. It captured several sugar crystals that had scattered near Mr. Finch's place setting. Dr. Hartwell examined the cloth with professional interest. These crystals are indeed irregular, quite different from properly prepared loaf sugar. The formation suggests they were dissolved in solution and reformed, exactly the process required for alkaloid integration. Miss Marple's gaze settled on Captain Ashworth with gentle but implacable focus. The preparation of such a poison would require intimate knowledge of the victim's habits, access to appropriate chemical compounds, and considerable advance planning. Someone who understood both Mr. Finch's personal vulnerabilities and this household's daily routines with exceptional thoroughness. Captain Ashworth's military bearing stiffened as though anticipating assault, his carefully controlled expression revealing the first genuine cracks in his composed facade. Surely such detailed speculation requires more substantial foundation than domestic observation. Perhaps, Miss Marple conceded with continued gentleness. Yet young Lily mentioned that you provided comprehensive instructions about Mr. Finch's specific requirements well before his actual arrival. Remarkably thorough preparation for what was supposedly an unexpected family visit. The observation struck with surgical precision. She continued with relentless kindness. Your military engineering training provided both the chemical knowledge and the disciplined planning necessary for such an elaborate scheme. The alkaloid compounds would be readily available through medical supply channels accessible to former officers. Mrs. Ashworth gasped audibly as the implications struck her. Jeremy, what is she suggesting? Miss Marple produced a folded document from her reticule with ceremonial deliberation. I discovered this among Mr. Finch's personal effects, separate from the Blackmail portfolio you so helpfully found, Captain. A letter from your commanding officer regarding certain financial irregularities in regimental funds. Irregularities that resulted in your quiet resignation rather than court-martial proceedings. The silence that followed seemed to expand like ripples in still water. Captain Ashworth's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, his military training unable to conceal the mounting desperation beneath his carefully maintained exterior. Mr. Finch possessed evidence of your embezzlement, Miss Marple continued with scientific precision. The missing funds, forged documents, gambling debts that necessitated the original theft. He threatened complete exposure unless you provided regular payments you simply couldn't manage. Dr. Hartwell observed the captain with sharpened medical attention, noting the subtle physiological changes that accompanied increasing psychological pressure. The tremor in his hands, the barely perceptible increase in breathing rate, the way his gaze avoided direct eye contact. The systematic nature of your planning was remarkable, Miss Marple observed with genuine professional admiration. The careful preparation of poisoned sugar crystals, the elaborate arrangements to ensure Mr. Finch received his specially prepared portion, even the advance instructions to household staff to guarantee perfect execution. Captain Ashworth's composed facade finally cracked completely, revealing beneath it the desperate calculation of someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing. He would have ruined me completely, he burst out, his voice raw with fear and self-pity. Uncle Alistair cared nothing for family, only for his vile schemes. When he arrived and began making demands, threatening to expose everything unless I provided substantial compensation I couldn't possibly manage. The confession emerged with inevitable force, detailing how the Christmas gathering had provided perfect cover for his premeditated crime. I never intended for it to happen during the family celebration, but when he began making those pointed comments during dinner, threatening to expose everyone's secrets, including my own, I realized he was beyond any reasonable negotiation. As the full scope of Captain Ashworth's elaborate deception became clear, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the tragic irony that someone trained to serve his country had instead chosen to serve only his own desperate circumstances, transforming the warm traditions of Christmas hospitality into a carefully orchestrated instrument of murder. The gentle snow continued its assault against the windows, but the storm within Ashworth Manor had finally reached its devastating and inevitable conclusion. The confession's echoes seemed to settle into the very walls of Ashworth Manor, transforming the elegant dining hall into a courtroom where justice had been served through patient observation rather than legal procedure. Captain Ashworth stood with the defeated posture of a man whose carefully constructed military bearing had finally crumbled under the gentle but relentless pressure of Miss Marple's methodical investigation. Mrs. Ashworth pressed her handkerchief to her lips, her face drained of color as the full scope of her nephew's betrayal became clear. "Jeremy," she whispered, her voice carrying decades of familial affection now poisoned by horrible understanding. "How could you corrupt our Christmas gathering for such a purpose, the very traditions meant to bring joy?" The sound of approaching vehicles cut through the manor's oppressive silence. Constable Davies arrived with the practical efficiency of a village officer accustomed to domestic disputes rather than elaborate murders, though his respectful attention to Miss Marple's explanations suggested prior experience with her peculiar talent for being correct about unpleasant matters. Miss Marple recounted the evening's events with scientific precision, her gentle voice weaving together the seemingly disparate threads of observation and deduction. "The crime began with intimate knowledge of Mr. Finch's particular habits, Constable. Someone understood that his insistence on specific sugar arrangements could be transformed into the perfect delivery method for alkaloid compounds." She produced the damask cloth with its telltale crystalline residue, explaining how the irregular formations indicated chemical tampering rather than natural preparation. Captain Ashworth's military engineering training provided both the chemical knowledge and the disciplined planning necessary for such elaborate preparation. The alkaloid compounds would be readily available through medical supply channels accessible to former officers. Dr. Hartwell provided professional corroboration, confirming that the poisoning method required weeks of careful preparation and precise dosage calculations. The systematic removal of evidence during the night, the washed cup, the missing sugar bowl, the vanished tongs, demonstrated someone with unrestricted access to the dining hall and comprehensive understanding of what traces might prove incriminating. "The tragedy," Miss Marple observed as the captain was taken into custody, "lies not merely in the choice of murder as solution, but in the corruption of institutions once held sacred. Military honor, family loyalty, even Christmas hospitality, all became instruments in an elaborate deception designed to silence an inconvenient blackmailer." As official procedures concluded and the remaining guests prepared their subdued departures, Miss Marple gathered her knitting with the methodical attention she brought to all domestic tasks. The manor, which had welcomed them with such festive warmth only 24 hours earlier, now seemed somehow diminished by knowledge of what had transpired within its walls. Miss Pemberton collected her belongings with shell-shocked efficiency, while the Blackwoods maintained careful politeness despite having witnessed more of their neighbors' secrets than comfortable social interaction would normally permit. The vicar, cleared of financial improprieties but profoundly shaken by his proximity to both murder and false accusation, departed with promises of proper audits and renewed dedication to transparent church management. The snow had finally ceased its gentle assault, revealing muddy tracks where official vehicles had disturbed the pristine landscape. Miss Marple observed how nature's attempt to restore purity was inevitably marked by human intervention, much like the peaceful village life they had all assumed was immune to sophisticated evil. "Human nature remains remarkably consistent," she reflected to Mrs. Ashworth as arrangements were made for her return journey. People reveal their intentions through the smallest actions, though we often prefer to interpret kindness where calculation exists. Mr. Finch's particular habits became his vulnerability because someone understood them too well and possessed the knowledge to exploit that understanding fatally. As her vehicle departed through the melting snow, Miss Marple looked back at Ashworth Manor, standing silhouetted against the grey winter sky. The grand house would eventually recover its capacity for genuine hospitality, she suspected, though the memory of this particular Christmas gathering would linger long after spring returned to Little Wickham. The village would process these events in its own way, retelling, reinterpreting, gradually transforming shocking reality into cautionary tale. Captain Ashworth would be remembered as much for his weakness as his wickedness, though the precision of his planning would serve as reminder that the most dangerous criminals often possessed both intelligence and training that should have been applied to nobler purposes. In her experience, even the most carefully orchestrated crimes ultimately failed because they required their perpetrators to anticipate and control every human variable, a level of omniscience that remained, thankfully, beyond reach of even the most calculating criminal mind. The gentle art of observation, applied with patience and understanding of human nature's consistent patterns, would always prove superior to elaborate deception, no matter how cleverly conceived or expertly executed.